Continuing our conversations this week in Kansas City, Missouri, as the National Association of Farm Broadcasting gathers for its 80th convention. We're talking with agricultural industry groups here this week, and a lot of moving parts happening out in our nation's capital this week, of course, with funding being the hot topic for federal agencies. Joining us here today from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association's D.C. office is Ethan Lane, the Vice President of Government Affairs. And Ethan, you're down here in KC talking with farm broadcasters from across the nation, and we're all following this very closely. Obviously, we saw an extension with that continuing resolution, passed just today. What does this mean for farmers and ranchers in terms of a farm bill and other funding mechanisms?
Well, given some of the challenges we've seen with the Freedom Caucus and with these kind of more fringe members of the House Republican Conference over the last month, getting this bill out of the House is a big deal. It sends it over to the Senate. It allows them to work their process. Hopefully it will reach the president's desk by that deadline at midnight on Friday night. And it will give the supply chain a little bit of certainty. I think that's been the concern for farmers and ranchers is what's next, right? I mean, we have that shutdown plan that was articulated back in September from USDA and the Department of Interior. We know their intent during a shutdown was and is to inflict as much pain on voters as possible so that they'll call their members of Congress and say, hey, you got to fix this. Certainly, with a senator in Montana like a congressman in Montana like Matt Rosendale, who's been actively engaged in some of that. Other members like Matt Gaetz, similar. The goal there being that their constituents call and say, you got to come to the table and fix this. Alleviating that concern, avoiding that, at least through the holidays, is a big win and gives us a little bit of time to kind of get these bills finished up, make sure that those funding mechanisms are done properly, and start looking towards next year's bills that they've got to get started with here in a few months.
Well, and obviously the Farm Bill expired at the end of September 2023 here this year, and there was a lot of hope initially that a new Farm Bill, the 2023 bill, could have been completed at this time.
Yeah.
Obviously, that is not the scenario right now. So what is this looking like as we look towards an extension of that Farm Bill and the work that needs to go in of actually drafting a Farm Bill for 2024, 2025, however that process may go?
Right. This extension gets this thing out of the current kind of toxic political climate that we're in Washington. And that's especially important for a $1 trillion spending and authorization package, right? This is not a typical piece of legislation. That nutrition portion, which is 85% of that bill, highly contentious, hasn't really been talked about since the debt limit deal earlier this year. We keep reminding people there was still some fighting to be done, amongst the committees, regardless of whether Senator Stabenow, Chairwoman Stabenow, says she's done talking about that. House Republicans definitely are not. And so there's definitely some work left to be done there. We know there are drafts kind of at least conceptually done on both sides of the Hill. G.T. Thompson was for a while there, a week or so ago, trying to get some time in December to work through that bill. I think this is more realistic to have these next few months to work through that process. And I think everyone needs to kind of, be comfortable with the idea that 2 months before this presidential election may also be a bad time to do that. And if so, they may extend it again. And if that happens, it's not the first time it's happened. We've certainly seen the 2012 Farm Bill become the 2014 Farm Bill by the time it was done. You got to find that right window to land a jumbo jet this big. So hopefully they'll keep looking for those opportunities.
Well, there's definitely going to have to be a lot of compromise between the House and Senate, and pointing out that Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan is not seeking re-election,
right.
And I know she would like to retire with a Farm Bill passed. Do you think that may help in the negotiations, in the back and forth with some of these funding items?
It certainly should add some motivation for folks to come together and find some common ground. I think that you have participants here that are looking for compromise. The problem with the Farm Bill has never been the ag committees, right? It's never been the ag state members. It's the folks that don't deal with this on a regular basis in Congress or who want to leverage that process for other reasons or have kind of ulterior motives that insert themselves into that equation at the point that it comes to the floor. So I have all the confidence in the world that the members of the ag committees in the House and Senate, R's and D's both, are going to continue their really good work on this product. It's about selling it to the rest of the body. and whether that deal, whether Chairwoman Stabenow and Chairman Thompson can cut a deal that makes sense. That's where their eyes are going to be. Is not on their committees. It's going to be on those other members.
Now, as we look to other news, especially the Endangered Species Act, more news out of the Biden administration this week in terms of grizzly bears up in the Northern Cascades ecosystems. You and I have talked about this in the past. Obviously, there's a lot of people against the reintroduction efforts, but just share a little more on what unraveled here this week in D.C.
Well, whenever you see the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service doing these reintroductions, right, whether it's Mexican gray wolves in Arizona, black-footed ferrets, grizzly bears, you're quite literally injecting cancer into rural communities. And I hate to be that sort of hyperbolic about it, but that's really what we're talking about here, right? You're putting this additional burden on communities that are already struggling to manage their resources. These bears, we know, would migrate into these areas on their own over time. And Congressman Newhouse made this comment to me a few weeks ago when we were talking about this issue. Someone used the term reintroduction, and he said, well, that implies they were there in the first place. That's not what this is. This is an introduction of grizzly bears into the North Cascades ecosystem. And that's incredibly frustrating for, I think, the producers that are in that area that then have to deal with extremely large apex predators being introduced into their backyard. We need to really take a look at how we can start to finally make some statutory changes to the Endangered Species Act. We in the cattle industry and anyone who's managing landscapes being subject to this regulatory wave in and out with each administration is incredibly damaging to their ability to know what's next over the next couple of years. So I'm hopeful that the Hill will have some time over the next year or two to refocus on some statutory changes that can relieve a little pressure for producers.
And what are some of the cattlemen? Obviously, the Washington Cattlemen, they just held their annual meeting. What's some of the work that NCBA is doing with them and along the other states that have grizzly bears like Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, to really bring awareness to this and help those Washington producers have a voice in this as well?
Well, it's really important because when you set up when the government sets up these comment periods, right? We know what happens. You have tens of thousands of people that live in condos in Salt Lake or in Seattle or in Denver that are weighing in on this that don't have to live with these predators as part of their daily lives. And helping the agencies understand and illustrating to the public the difference between a truly impacted stakeholder that is going to have to live with these animals and someone who thinks they're cool on TV is a really important distinction to be made as part of that process, and one that when they hold meetings on this kind of thing in urban areas, you kind of know what kind of voices you're going to get in the room. So any opportunity we can have to elevate those voices of folks that are actually going to be impacted and are going to carry this burden, that's job number one, and making sure that they're the ones whose voices are being considered as they move through this process.
Well, again, Ethan Lane, Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, join us here today. Thank you for taking a few moments to talk about a few of the several issues that NCBA works on day in, day out for cattlemen and women.
You got it.
Well, again, friends, we're going to continue to talk with more movers and shakers in agriculture this week in Kansas City as the National Association of Farm Broadcasting hosts its 80th convention here in Kansas City.